The war was a merciless devourer, a grinding machine that consumed everything in its path, but for the women of Germany it was also a cruel teacher. They had been raised on a diet of fervent nationalism, indoctrinated with the belief that their Führer was a messianic figure and their cause a righteous one. They were the wives, mothers, and sisters who had bid farewell to their men on the front, the girls who had traded their dolls for duties in the Reich. They were the essential cogs in a war machine that promised them a new world order. And when that machine began to crumble, when the bombs fell like rain and the Allied armies closed in, they were left to face the brutal consequences. But as the dust settled and the final shots were fired, a different kind of war began. A conflict fought not with bullets and bombs, but with the profound shock of a gentle smile. The air in Berlin was a suffocating miasma of dust, smoke, and despair. It was the spring of 1945, and the city that had once been the beating heart of the Third Reich was now a shattered mausoleum. The once grand boulevards were choked with rubble, the iconic Brandenburg Gate stood sentinel over a landscape of ruin, and the sounds of shelling were a constant, terrifying symphony. For Elsa Schmidt, a 24-year-old nurse who had spent the last 2 years patching up the mangled bodies of young soldiers in a makeshift field hospital, the end felt less like a defeat and more like an overdue release. She had witnessed the descent into madness firsthand, the slow erosion of hope as the war turned against them. She had seen the vacant stares of the wounded, the terror in the eyes of the dying, and she had long since abandoned the fervent beliefs of her youth. The Nazi promises of a 1,000-year Reich had evaporated like smoke, leaving behind only the bitter taste of defeat. As the Red Army's advance grew more relentless, the hospital became a scene of chaotic desperation. Wounded soldiers screamed for their mothers. Doctors worked until they collapsed, and the air was thick with the stench of antiseptic and death. Elsa moved through the carnage with a practiced, weary grace, her hands stained with blood, her heart a hollow echo. She and her colleagues, a small group of women who had once believed they were the guardians of a new world, were now merely survivors in a dying one. The sound of Russian artillery grew louder, and the last of the able-bodied men fled, leaving the women and the wounded behind. There was no grand stand, no heroic last defense, just the final, pathetic whimper of a broken regime. In the flickering candlelight of the cellar, as the building shuddered from the concussions of explosions, Elsa looked at the faces of the other nurses. They were all young, some barely out of their teens, and their eyes held the same silent question. What happens now? The answer came in the form of a thunderous crash as the cellar doors were blown inward. Russian soldiers, their faces grimed with dirt and their eyes burning with a righteous fury, stormed in, their submachine guns raised. The nurses recoiled, their hands instinctively flying to their mouths, a collective gasp of terror filling the air. For months, the Nazi propaganda machine had painted the Soviets as subhuman monsters, a horde of barbarians who would brutalize and defile their women. The stories were whispered in hushed tones, tales of unspeakable acts, of a vengeance that would be swift and terrible. Elsa braced herself, her body tensing for the inevitable assault. She closed her eyes, preparing for the worst, but instead of the brutal assault she expected, there was only a moment of tense silence, broken by the guttural commands of a Russian officer. He gestured with his gun, a sweep of his arm that encompassed all of them, and his voice, though rough and alien, held an unmistakable command. Out! They were herded out into the shattered streets, a procession of bewildered women in blood-splattered uniforms. The Russian soldiers, though menacing, kept their distance. There was no conversation, no taunts, just a silent, armed presence that herded them like cattle through the ruins of their city. Elsa looked at the grim faces of the men who had been painted as monsters, and she was struck by the absence of the savage glee she had been warned about. They were exhausted, their uniforms torn and dirty, their eyes holding the same weariness she saw in her own reflection. As they were marched past the smoldering ruins of the Reichstag and into a makeshift holding area, a cold rain began to fall, washing the soot from their faces and leaving them to wonder if this was to be the extent of their punishment. The Russian occupation of Berlin was brutal, but it was not the end. The war, for the women of Germany, was about to enter a new, more confounding phase. They had been told to expect a ravenous beast, but what they found in the days and weeks that followed was a different kind of animal altogether, one that had been forged in the fires of a brutal ideology. The true test of their faith and of their understanding of the world was yet to come, not from the Eastern Front, but from the West. They had been taught to despise the American GIs, to see them as weak, decadent, and unworthy of a true warrior's respect. Their own men, they were told, were the paragons of military might and racial purity. But as the Allied armies closed in, the myth of German superiority began to crumble, and with it, the foundations of everything they had ever believed. The journey to the West was a long, arduous one, a forced march through a landscape of desolation and despair. The war was over, but its scars were everywhere. They saw the hollowed-out faces of civilians scavenging for food, the burned-out hulks of tanks rusting by the side of the road, the endless lines of displaced people moving in the opposite direction. They were a part of the human tide, a small, insignificant ripple in the vast ocean of refugees and prisoners. They were marched for days, subsisting on meager rations, their clothes caked with mud, their spirits worn down by the endless trek. As they moved further west, the Russian guards were replaced by a new group of captors, men in crisp, olive-drab uniforms who spoke a language they couldn't understand. The switch was abrupt and disorienting. They had been in Russian custody for weeks, a period of uncertainty and fear that had, at least, become a grim routine. The new men were different. They were cleaner, their weapons seemed more efficient, and their faces, though serious, lacked the same hardened intensity of the Red Army soldiers. They were Americans, and as the column of German women was led into a sprawling POW camp, a wave of cold dread washed over Elsa. She had seen the propaganda posters, the caricatures of the greedy, materialistic Americans. She had been taught to see them as the antithesis of all that was noble and pure in the German spirit. She had braced herself for the worst, for a new form of cruelty, a different kind of punishment. But as she was processed, her uniform replaced with a drab, shapeless dress, and her name recorded in a series of unfamiliar clicks and clacks on a typewriter, she was met with a bewildering absence of malice. The American soldiers, the ones who had been painted as the ultimate villains, simply did their jobs with a quiet professionalism. They spoke to each other in a language she didn't understand, but their gestures were clear and their expressions were, to her astonishment, not filled with hatred, but with a kind of weary, detached sympathy. They were tired, just as she was, and the war, it seemed, had left its mark on them too. The true surprise, however, was yet to come. It was an ordinary afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground of the camp, when a young American soldier, no older than she was, approached her with a small, crumpled paper bag. He spoke in a halting, heavily accented German, but his meaning was unmistakable. He was offering her a chocolate bar. Elsa stared at the small piece of candy in his hand, her mind struggling to process the gesture. She had been taught to expect violence, to be prepared for degradation, but this act of simple, unexpected kindness was a foreign concept, a profound challenge to everything she had been taught about the enemy. She had been prepared for a beast, but in its place, she had found a gentle human face. The chocolate bar was a small, insignificant thing, but it was a crack in the edifice of her beliefs, a small chink in the armor of her ideology. The German women were not the only ones who had been indoctrinated. The American soldiers, too, had been taught to see their enemies as the embodiment of evil, as the architects of a monstrous regime. And yet here, in this quiet, dusty corner of a forgotten war, two worlds collided, not with the force of an explosion, but with the quiet, profound weight of a small act of kindness. What happens when the monsters you were taught to despise offer you a piece of candy? The answer for Elsa was a profound and unsettling revelation, one that would force her to confront the lies she had been living for a lifetime, and the gentle human truth that lay beneath them. The chocolate bar was a physical manifestation of a psychological shockwave. For Elsa and the other German women, it wasn't just a piece of candy. It was a profound contradiction. They had been raised in a world where the enemy was a caricature of evil, a faceless force to be defeated. The Nazi propaganda machine had tirelessly painted the Allied forces, and particularly the Americans, as weak, greedy, and morally corrupt. They were the antithesis of the German warrior spirit, and their defeat, it was believed, was an inevitable conclusion to a historical confrontation. And yet here was a young American soldier, his uniform crisp and clean, his eyes betraying no malice, offering a small, sweet gesture of humanity. Elsa took the chocolate bar, her fingers brushing against his, and the simple act felt like a betrayal of all she had ever known. The other women in the camp saw it too. They had been huddled together, a small, insular community of shared trauma and fear, and the sight of one of their own accepting something from the enemy was met with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and a quiet, desperate hope. The stories of American kindness, once whispered rumors, now had a face. They saw American soldiers sharing their cigarettes, tossing a baseball around with the children of the camp, even attempting to speak their language with a clumsy, endearing effort. These were not the monsters of their propaganda. They were just boys, far from home, who seemed as bewildered by the end of the war as they were. The camp was not a place of punishment, but a place of holding, a purgatory where the remnants of a shattered world waited for a new one to be built. The American soldiers were the wardens, but they were also the first architects of a different reality. They brought with them not just rations and medical supplies, but a different kind of currency, a quiet, almost unsettling decency. Elsa, emboldened by the chocolate bar, began to watch the Americans more closely. She saw them laugh, heard them talk about their families back home, and she began to realize the sheer absurdity of the Nazi narrative. These men who had come to liberate a continent were not filled with a burning hatred for the German people, but with a weary exhaustion and a longing for peace. The war, for them, had been a job, a grim necessity, and with its completion, their desire was not for revenge, but for a return to normalcy. The process of denazification was a slow, deliberate one, a painful unwinding of years of indoctrination. The American officers would hold lectures showing the women films of the concentration camps, of the atrocities committed in the name of the German people. At first, the women were defiant. They had been told these were fabrications, lies concocted by the enemy to demoralize them. But the images were visceral, the truth undeniable. The gaunt faces, the piles of bodies, the sheer scale of the horror. It was a reality they had been shielded from, a brutal, horrifying truth that shattered the last vestiges of their faith. Elsa, sitting in a makeshift hall, watched the images flicker on the screen, and she felt a wave of profound shame wash over her. She had been a part of this, a small, insignificant cog in a machine that had committed such unspeakable evil. The American officer, a kind-faced man with a solemn expression, spoke not with anger but with a quiet, devastating sadness. He was not there to condemn them, but to bear witness, to show them the full extent of the horror they had been a part of. The process was not about blame, but about reckoning. It was about forcing them to look at the man in the mirror and confront the lies they had been living. The women in the camp began to talk, at first in hushed whispers, and then with a growing sense of urgency. They shared their own stories of the fear, the hunger, the constant anxiety of living under a totalitarian regime. They began to realize that they were not alone in their disillusionment, that the promises of the Third Reich had been a cruel deception for everyone, including their own men who had died for a lie. The American soldiers, in their own way, became therapists. They listened, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding. They shared stories of their own families, of their own fears and hopes, and in doing so, they began to bridge the vast chasm that had separated them. A fragile trust began to form, a tentative bond built on a shared sense of humanity. The women began to ask questions, not just about the camp, but about America itself. What was it like? Was it true that everyone had a car? Did the women really wear such scandalous clothes? The American GIs answered with a kind of gentle amusement, painting a picture of a world that seemed impossibly distant, a world of abundance, freedom, and a vibrant, unapologetic chaos. It was a world that felt both alien and strangely appealing, a tantalizing glimpse of a future that was not defined by war, sacrifice, and endless suffering. For Elsa, the process of denazification was not just a historical lesson. It was a personal awakening. She began to see the German people, and herself, not as a superior race destined to rule, but as a traumatized people who had been led astray by a charismatic demagogue and a toxic ideology. The American soldiers, in their quiet professionalism and their unexpected kindness, were the living proof of the lie. They were not the decadent, weak-willed enemies of her indoctrination. They were the compassionate, resilient victors who had come to show them the path to a different kind of world. The gentle smiles of the American soldiers were more than just an expression of humanity. They were a quiet, powerful act of defiance against the very ideology they had defeated. They were a challenge to the German women to see them not as monsters, but as fellow human beings, and in doing so, to begin the long, painful process of healing. The women of the camp, having been stripped of their uniforms, their beliefs, and their sense of purpose, were forced to confront a new reality. They had been raised to hate, but they were now faced with a different kind of weapon, a kindness so profound and so unexpected that it shattered the very foundations of their worldview. But the road to redemption was long and fraught with peril, and a new threat, not from a military power, but from the insidious ghosts of their own past, was about to emerge. They had been freed from the bonds of war, but they were still prisoners of their own history. The first step was to acknowledge the truth, but the next, far more difficult step was to forgive themselves. How do you find redemption when the very air you breathe is thick with the ghosts of a 1,000-year lie? The answer was not in a swift, grand gesture, but in the small, quiet acts of humanity that would begin to mend the shattered souls of a generation. The war for them was over, but the fight for their own humanity had just begun. And in the quiet moments of reflection, the German women were forced to ask themselves a difficult question. Who were they, really, without the uniform, without the ideology, without the hate? The answers would come, but not without a painful and profound confrontation with the truth. The camp became a microcosm of a world in flux. As the German women began to shed the rigid identity of their past, the first fragile shoots of a new kind of social order began to emerge. The hierarchy of the Third Reich, with its strict class divisions and its emphasis on unquestioning obedience, was replaced by a more fluid, more humane system. The women, who had once been rivals in the race for ideological purity, now found themselves bound together by a shared sense of loss and uncertainty. They were all in the same boat, adrift in the choppy waters of post-war Europe, and their only hope for survival was to paddle together. The American soldiers, in their role as administrators and educators, were the unexpected catalysts for this change. They treated the women not as prisoners, but as human beings in need of guidance and support. They organized educational programs, teaching them about democracy, about civil liberties, and about the fundamental principles of a free society. The concepts were alien to the women, who had been raised on a diet of authoritarianism and collective sacrifice. The idea of individual rights, of freedom of speech and expression, was a radical departure from the world they had known. It was in these lectures that Elsa, with her sharp mind and her quiet determination, began to ask questions that went far beyond the scope of the curriculum. She asked about the American system of government, about the role of women in their society, about the concept of a free press. The American officers, surprised by her intellectual curiosity, answered with a kind of gentle patience, their answers opening up a world of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The trust between the women and the GIs grew, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared desire for a better future. The American soldiers, for their part, were not immune to the profound human drama unfolding before them. They saw the women not as the ideological enemies of their past, but as the victims of a monstrous regime. They saw their quiet dignity, their fierce determination to survive, and their slow, painful process of awakening. They were, in a sense, the midwives of a new Germany, and they took their responsibility seriously. They shared their food, their cigarettes, and their stories, and in doing so, they began to forge a new kind of relationship, one that transcended the boundaries of language and nationality. The camp was a strange liminal space, a world between worlds. It was no longer a prison, but not yet a home. It was a place where the past was slowly being buried and the future was being born, but the past had a long shadow. As the women began to open up, they also began to confront the insidious guilt of their own complicity. Many of them had been members of the Nazi Party or had worked in some capacity to support the war effort. They had been taught that their loyalty was a virtue, but now, in the face of the truth, it felt like a moral failing. The burden of guilt was a heavy one, and it manifested in 1,000 different ways. Some women became withdrawn and sullen, their faces a mask of unreadable regret. Others became defensive, lashing out at the Americans and even at their fellow German women in a desperate attempt to deflect the blame. There was a palpable sense of internal conflict, a struggle between the ingrained beliefs of their past and the emerging realities of their present. The American officers, recognizing the psychological toll, began to incorporate group therapy sessions into the daily routine. The women were encouraged to talk about their experiences, to share their fears and their feelings of shame. It was a difficult and painful process, a slow unwinding of a lifetime of suppressed emotions. But in the act of sharing their stories, they began to realize that they were not alone in their suffering. They were all victims of a system that had exploited their loyalty and their patriotism for its own monstrous ends. The American GIs, in a quiet, unobtrusive way, continued to be a source of solace and support. They would often sit in on the sessions, not as judges, but as a silent, empathetic presence. They would listen to the stories of the women, their faces a mixture of sorrow and understanding. They were not there to forgive them, but to bear witness to their suffering, and in doing so, to help them find a path to their own redemption. The simple act of being seen, of being heard, was a powerful and transformative experience. It was in one of these sessions that a young woman named Greta, a former member of the League of German Girls, broke down in tears. She spoke of her blind devotion to the Führer, of the parades and the rallies, and of the profound, crushing emptiness she felt when she realized that everything she had believed in was a lie. The women in the room listened in silence, their own eyes welling up with tears. They all had their own version of Greta's story, their own personal betrayal to contend with. The American officer, a man named Sergeant Miller, simply reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything, but the gesture was more powerful than any words. It was an act of simple human empathy, a profound and quiet declaration that she was not alone, and that her suffering was seen and acknowledged. The women in the camp were not just being denazified, they were being rehumanized. They were being taught to see themselves not as a single monolithic entity, but as a collection of individuals, each with their own story, their own pain, and their own path to redemption. The gentle smiles of the American soldiers were a constant reminder of this. They were a beacon of hope in the darkness, a quiet, powerful symbol of a different kind of world, a world where enemies could become allies, and where a shared sense of humanity could triumph over the corrosive legacy of hate. The process was slow and often painful, but it was working. The women were beginning to shed the heavy cloak of their past and to embrace the fragile, uncertain promise of the future. The war, for them, had been a lesson in the dangers of blind obedience, and the aftermath was a lesson in the power of a single, gentle act of kindness. But the road ahead was not without its challenges. The women were beginning to confront their own complicity, but the world outside the camp, the world they would one day return to, was still a place of ruin and desolation. How would they rebuild their lives in the ashes of their own creation? How would they explain to their children and their families the profound and transformative change that had taken place inside them? The answers were not clear, and the future was a frighteningly blank canvas. But for the first time in a long time, the women of the camp, with the quiet support of their former enemies, were beginning to feel a glimmer of hope. The gentle smile of a U.S. soldier was not just an act of kindness. It was a promise, a quiet declaration that they were not alone, and that the long, painful process of healing had finally begun. And as the days turned into weeks, a new kind of tension began to emerge, not from the lingering resentments of the past, but from the complex, unsettling emotions of the present. The women had found a kind of peace within the confines of the camp. But what would happen when they were released back into the world? The answers were about to be revealed, and with them, the true test of their newfound humanity. The camp, once a symbol of defeat and imprisonment, had evolved into a crucible of transformation. The women who had entered its gates as a defeated and demoralized group were now a community in the truest sense of the word. They shared their food, their stories, and their dreams for a future that was, for the first time in their lives, not dictated by the Führer. The American soldiers, in turn, had become more than just their captors. They were their teachers, their confidants, and, in a way, their first true friends from the outside world. The relationship was complex and nuanced, a fragile tapestry woven from shared humanity and the profound, silent understanding that they had all been victims of a war that had devoured a generation. The GIs, with their youthful energy and their easy smiles, had become a source of fascination and a point of reference for a new world. The women, having been raised on a diet of strict social decorum, were captivated by the American soldiers' casual confidence and their easy camaraderie. They were a living, breathing testament to a different kind of masculinity, one that was not defined by rigid discipline and unquestioning obedience, but by a quiet, self-assured strength. This was a profound and unsettling revelation for the German women, who had been taught to revere the ruthless efficiency of the German war machine and the iron will of the Aryan warrior. The American soldiers, with their easy jokes and their genuine smiles, were a living refutation of this ideology. They were not the decadent weaklings of their propaganda, but a new kind of hero, one whose strength lay not in their ability to dominate, but in their capacity to care. Elsa, in her role as a de facto leader among the women, found herself in the middle of this profound cultural exchange. She spent hours talking with Sergeant Miller, the kind-faced officer who had been instrumental in the denazification program. They spoke of everything, from the mundane details of daily life in America to the philosophical implications of their shared history. Miller, a former history teacher from Ohio, spoke with a quiet passion about the ideals of democracy, about the importance of a free and open society, and about the fundamental human rights that had been so brutally violated by the regime they had all fought to overthrow. Elsa, in turn, shared her own story of her disillusionment with the Nazi Party, of her quiet acts of rebellion in the hospital, and of the profound sense of betrayal she felt when the truth about the concentration camps came to light. The conversations were a form of therapy for both of them, a way of making sense of a world that had been turned upside down. They were also the first seeds of a new kind of relationship, one that transcended the boundaries of language and nationality, and that was built on a foundation of shared vulnerability and a mutual respect for the truth. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the camp began to take on a more permanent feel. The women were no longer just prisoners. They were residents, with a schedule, a sense of purpose, and a small but growing community of their own. The American officers, in a quiet and almost imperceptible way, began to integrate themselves into this community. They organized baseball games, teaching the women and children the rules of a sport that was as alien to them as the concepts of democracy and individual rights. They held concerts, singing American folk songs and playing jazz music on makeshift instruments. The sound of the music, with its improvisational rhythms and its soulful melodies, was a profound and jarring contrast to the rigid, martial music of the Third Reich. It was a sound of freedom, of spontaneity, of a joyful chaos that was both frightening and exhilarating. The women, at first hesitant, began to join in, their voices tentative at first, but then with a growing sense of confidence. The shared laughter, the shared songs, and the shared moments of quiet understanding were a powerful antidote to the years of fear and repression. They were slowly, painstakingly beginning to learn what it meant to be human again, but the real world, with its cold, hard realities, was waiting for them outside the gates. As the war ended and the process of repatriation began, the women were forced to confront a new and difficult question. What would they do now? Their homes were in ruins, their families were scattered, and the country they had been taught to love and revere was now a shattered shell of its former self. The American soldiers, for their part, were also facing their own uncertain future. They were no longer just GIs on a mission. They were individuals with their own lives, their own families, and their own dreams. The easy camaraderie of the camp was about to be replaced by the harsh realities of the post-war world. The quiet, gentle peace they had found in this small corner of Germany was a fragile and fleeting thing, and it was about to be tested. The women who had found a kind of peace and purpose in the camp were about to be released back into a world that was still filled with ghosts and shadows. The denazification program had taught them to confront the past, but it had not prepared them for the difficult and often painful process of rebuilding the future. The war had taken everything from them, and now, with the easy smiles of their American captors as their only guide, they were about to embark on a new kind of journey, one that would take them not across the battlefield, but across the emotional landscape of their own hearts. They had been taught to hate, and they had learned to love. But what would happen when the world outside the camp, with its lingering resentments and its unhealed wounds, came knocking at their door? The first step was to acknowledge the truth. The second was to forgive themselves. And the third, and most difficult, was to rebuild. And in this process, the gentle smiles of the American soldiers, which had once been a source of profound shock, were about to become a source of profound strength. The women were about to discover that the enemy they had been taught to despise was, in fact, the one who had given them the most precious gift of all, a second chance. The release from the camp was not the triumphant moment of liberation the women had once envisioned. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic event. One by one, their names were called, and they were given a small duffel bag with a change of clothes, a few rations, and a travel pass to their home city. The American soldiers, their faces a mixture of relief and a quiet sadness, stood by as the women said their final goodbyes to the only home they had known for months. The final handshake between Elsa and Sergeant Miller was a moment of profound and understated emotion. He wished her well, his voice choked with a quiet sincerity, and she, in turn, thanked him for everything, her words a poor substitute for the gratitude she felt in her heart. He was more than a soldier to her. He was a mirror, a reflection of a different kind of world, one that had been hidden from her for a lifetime. He was the gentle smile that had shattered her world, and the kind hand that had helped her rebuild it. As she walked out of the gates, a free woman once more, she felt a profound sense of disorientation. The world outside the camp was a ghost town, a landscape of rubble and ruin, and the people she encountered were gaunt and hollow-eyed, their faces a grim testament to the long, dark years of war. She was a stranger in her own country, a woman who had been changed forever by her time with the enemy. She traveled by train, a slow, arduous journey on a rail system that was barely functional. The countryside, once a patchwork of rolling hills and picturesque villages, was now a scarred and barren landscape. She saw the evidence of the war everywhere, the burned-out husks of tanks, the shattered remnants of bridges, the countless lines of people moving in search of food and shelter. The people on the train were silent, their faces a mask of weary despair. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a disconnection from the very people she had been taught to revere as her own. She was no longer a part of the collective, no longer a cog in the grand machine of the Third Reich. She was an individual, a woman with her own thoughts, her own feelings, and her own profound sense of shame. When she finally arrived in her home city of Hamburg, the sight was more devastating than she could have imagined. The once vibrant port city was a smoldering ruin, a testament to the brutal efficiency of the Allied air raids. Her childhood home was gone, a pile of rubble where a lifetime of memories had once stood. The only thing left was a small, scorched photograph of her family, a silent reminder of a life that was now gone forever. She was alone, a small, insignificant figure in a world that had been turned upside down. She spent the next few weeks living in a makeshift shelter, scrounging for food and trying to make sense of her new reality. The people she met were suspicious and guarded. They had all lost so much, and they were not willing to trust a stranger, especially one who had the air of a woman who had seen things they could not understand. She was no longer just a German woman. She was a woman who had been a prisoner of war, a woman who had spent time with the enemy, and a woman who carried the quiet burden of a past she could not speak of. The process of rebuilding was not just about the physical world. It was about rebuilding the social and emotional landscape of their lives. And for the women who had been in the American camps, the process was fraught with a unique set of challenges. They had been denazified, but the people around them had not. They still held on to the old resentments, the old hatreds, and the old propaganda. They were not ready to forgive, and they were certainly not ready to trust the very people who had defeated them. The gentle smiles of the American soldiers were a foreign concept here, a sign of weakness, a symbol of a world they did not want to understand. Elsa, in her quiet, determined way, began to try to build a new life for herself. She found work in a small bakery, where she spent her days kneading dough and baking bread for the hungry people of the city. The work was hard and the pay was meager, but it was honest work, and it gave her a sense of purpose. She spent her nights reading, borrowing books from a small makeshift library that had been set up by the American relief workers. She read everything she could get her hands on, from American novels to philosophical texts, her mind hungry for new ideas, new ways of seeing the world. She was a woman who had been given a second chance, and she was determined to make the most of it. But the past had a long and insidious memory. One day, a former neighbor, a woman she had known since childhood, confronted her on the street. "You were with the Americans," the woman said, her voice filled with a mixture of accusation and contempt. "They say they treated you well, that you were given food and clothes, that you were treated like a princess." The words were like a physical blow. The woman's face was gaunt and ravaged by hunger and despair, and her eyes held a profound and bitter envy. She saw not a woman who had been a prisoner, but a woman who had been a collaborator, a woman who had betrayed her people for a few scraps of food and a kind word. The gentle smiles of the American soldiers, which had been a source of comfort in the camp, were now a source of suspicion and a sign of her own profound and unforgivable betrayal. Elsa stood there silent, unable to defend herself. How could she explain the profound transformation that had taken place inside her? How could she explain that the kind smiles of her former enemies had been a profound and necessary lesson in humanity? The world she had been released into was a world of black and white, a world of good and evil, and there was no room for the complex, nuanced shades of gray that she had come to understand. She was a woman caught between two worlds, a German who no longer felt German, and a person who had found a kind of home in the hearts of her former enemies. But she was about to discover that the greatest challenge of her life was not the war itself, but the long, arduous process of rebuilding a world from the ashes, and in doing so, confronting the ghosts of a past that refused to be buried. The next chapter of her life was about to begin, and it would not be a story of war, but of a quiet, relentless struggle for redemption. The accusation from her former neighbor was a microcosm of the larger struggle facing all the German women who had been through the American POW camps. They were not seen as victims, but as collaborators, as women who had been corrupted by the enemy. The old social order, though shattered, still held a powerful grip on the psyche of the German people. The idea of a German woman accepting help from an American soldier was a profound and unsettling betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe. The men who had been in the POW camps and who had been similarly denazified and re-educated faced a different but no less painful struggle. They were seen as weak, as men who had capitulated to the enemy, and their quiet, newfound sense of humanity was often met with suspicion and contempt. The war had created a chasm between the people who had been in the camps and those who had not, a chasm that was not just physical but psychological and emotional. The people who had been on the home front, who had lost their homes, their families, and their sense of purpose, saw the former prisoners as a new and unwelcome kind of elite. They had not shared in their suffering, and they did not understand their newfound sense of peace. Elsa, in her quiet, resilient way, refused to be a victim of this new social order. She continued to work at the bakery, and she continued to read, her mind a fortress of new ideas and new ways of seeing the world. She sought out the other women from the camp, and they began to form a small, unofficial support group, a quiet community of survivors who understood the unique burden they carried. They would meet in the evenings, huddled together in a small, rented room, and they would talk about their experiences, their fears, and their hopes for the future. They were a small, brave island of humanity in a vast and unforgiving ocean of despair. The American relief workers, who had been instrumental in their education, were still a part of their lives, and they would often stop by to offer food, clothing, and a few kind words of encouragement. The German women, in turn, began to offer their own kind of help, volunteering at the local orphanage, helping to rebuild a small school, and teaching the children the lessons they had learned in the camp, lessons about tolerance, about forgiveness, and about the fundamental importance of treating every human being with dignity and respect. The gentle smiles of the American soldiers had become a living, breathing testament to a new way of life, a quiet revolution that was taking place not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of a generation of women who had been given a second chance. But the road to redemption was long and fraught with peril. The ghosts of the past were never far behind. One day, a group of angry young men who had been a part of the Hitler Youth and who had not been in the camps, confronted Elsa and her friends on the street. They called them traitors, collaborators, and whores. They spat on them and tried to physically intimidate them. The women, who had been taught to stand up for themselves, stood their ground. They did not fight back, but they did not cower. Elsa, with a quiet strength that surprised even herself, simply looked at the men and said, "We have seen what hate does. We have lived through it, and we will not be a part of it anymore." The words were not an act of defiance, but an act of profound and quiet courage. The men, surprised by her resolve, backed down, but the incident was a stark reminder that the war, though over, still cast a long shadow over their lives. The women who had been taught to fear the enemy now had to confront the hatred and suspicion of their own people. The gentle smiles of the American soldiers were a profound and necessary act of humanity, but they were also a source of division, a symbol of a world that was no longer black and white, but a complex and nuanced shade of gray. As the years passed, the women continued to rebuild their lives, one small quiet act of humanity at a time. They started businesses, raised families, and became a part of the new democratic Germany that was slowly emerging from the ashes. Their children, who had been born into a world of ruin and despair, grew up in a world of hope and promise, a world that was fundamentally different from the one their mothers had known. The women, in their quiet way, had become the architects of a new kind of social order, one that was not built on a foundation of hate and division, but on a foundation of tolerance, forgiveness, and a profound sense of shared humanity. The gentle smiles of the American soldiers, which had once been a source of profound shock, were now a source of profound strength, a constant reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single simple act of kindness could change the world. The women, who had been raised to be a part of a brutal and unforgiving regime, had been given a second chance, and they had, in their own quiet and resilient way, become the living, breathing proof that even in the aftermath of the most horrific war in human history, the human spirit, with a little help from a gentle smile, could always find a way to rise from the ashes. The war had taken everything from them, but it had also given them something profound and unexpected, a new way to be human. They had been taught to hate, but they had learned to love, and in doing so, they had not only saved themselves, but they had also helped to save a nation. Their story was not a story of war, but a story of redemption, a story that was not written in the pages of history books, but in the quiet, gentle gestures of a generation of women who had found a new way to live. But the past was not so easily forgotten, and the long, slow process of healing was far from over. The women had found a kind of peace, but what about the men they had lost? The fathers, the brothers, the sons who had died for a lie? The answers were not in the past, but in the future, in the long, arduous journey of a nation learning to forgive itself.